It's an honor to be here with you.
Great to be with you too, Sarah.
The first question that I ask all of my podcast guests is a bit unconventional. It's, how has your faith in however you think about or conceptualize the word faith shaped who you are and what you do in the world?
I would say my faith is centrally faith in humanity. It gets questioned now and then, but I look to the best of humanity to get inspiration for the work I do, and I've chosen a career working for the benefit of the world, international organizations, UN organizations, and media. I really believe media plays a really key role too. And I am surrounded with the worst of humanity, and inhumanity to man is in every war and in almost every theater of my work. But I'm seeing also the people who survive it and their incredible perseverance, their resilience, and what it all comes down to in the end, and that is the people we love and just our own survival. So yeah, that's what keeps me going.
You started your career in journalism, and then you transitioned to humanitarian work, and now you lead global comms for the United Nations. Was there a moment or an event that really crystallized your desire to move from reporting on global issues to actively working within them?
It was not really by design, because I was going to be a foreign correspondent. And, when you're young, you also are looking for a stable job as well. So my first job was with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So it was working for a media organization, a unique one. It was working abroad. I'm American, and this was in Germany, and it was broadcasting over the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So I was, full of all kinds of nationalities and former journalists in exile. It was a really exciting place. But I ended up with a communications job. And I actually found it really interesting because I could use my journalism experience. I understood, where the media was coming from, that was, constantly coming to us as a resource. And I had the ability to tell stories and to take really complex information and turn it into digestible, hopefully, content that, that our stakeholders could understand, to be that kind of bridge into an organization. And I found it interesting. It was tough for me to make that. I knew that if I took a communications job, it would be hard to go back to journalism, but I haven't regretted it.
We have just wrapped up the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. What stood out to you most this year? Were there any shifts in developments, unexpected developments, shifts in global priorities that surprised you?
Well, I don't know if there's anything that totally surprised me. What we had been preparing for 2 years was a summit of the future to be held on the eve of the General Assembly. And it was a vision of the Secretary General. But this was before the Ukraine war. It was before the Israel-Gaza war. It was before the Sudan war. And the geopolitical tensions that exist in this building were not there. But he still had the vision to keep going. We need this summit of the future because what it was going to do was to reform the architecture of the UN and the international system that was born after World War II. And the world has changed so much since then. And we needed an updated system. And this worked. So there is 193 member states adopted a pact for the future. And, it's not a revolution, but it lays the groundwork for reform of the Security Council, of the international financial system, and also the governance of AI, which a lot of people are worried about. So we all felt really like this was a historic accomplishment at this General Assembly, especially at a time of so much division and global tension.
It's amazing. than 10% of the speakers this year at UNGA were women. Does that surprise you?
It depresses me. I don't know if it surprises me, but it's worse than it was last year. So it is a representation of women leadership in the world, and it is a snapshot, So it's sad, and it's interesting that we put it together as a tweet, and I know that UN Women did the same, and UNFPA, and it really gets a lot of attention because people are still shocked that after all this time, are we only that far, or have we gone even backwards in women leadership?
Yeah.
So it's sad, and even the Secretary General put this out on his social media that this has got to change.
There's a delicate balance between maintaining the UN's credibility while at the same time acknowledging its limitations.
Well, these are elected officials. We can only try to, advocate for women leaders. We have a lot of concerns about how difficult it is in today's environment to be a woman political leader, to be a woman in politics.
Yeah.
The digital environment is so vicious. And, study after study, it reveals that women politicians are under attack. Attempts to silence them are almost daily. And, some are just saying, I don't know if I need this, and throwing in the towel. And that's exactly what we don't want to see. So we need to support women leaders much more.
Before you were appointed head of Global Comms, you served at the UN Refugee Agency for 10 years. You were also head of comms there. And your work has focused so much on humanizing data, telling stories of those most impacted. What is one of the most important lessons that you've learned from those living in conflict zones that has given you a sense of hope?
Well, one from those who I have met who have gone through hell, have had to leave their homes suddenly, have lost family members, have had to flee into the unknown with very little, and restart their lives. It's just incredible what some humans can survive, and the hope that they're able to keep. Almost everything is gone, but what still they manage to keep inside of them is hope. And that's what, as a communicator, I feel obliged to also kind of capture and get out there into the world. And that's why, it's really easy to put out press releases with the statistics of, millions of refugees and human suffering on grand scales. But we know from social science that when people see mass suffering,
Yeah.
It's called like compassion collapse. There's a social scientist who's found that the more who die, the less we care. Even if you really, really, really try, it's just this feeling of overwhelm. And so it's really important for me as a communicator to understand that and to make sure that when we do communicate about refugees in this case, who are in great need of support, but are in large numbers, we need to communicate them about them in a way that not just informs but also opens hearts.
Yeah.
And gives people the feeling that they want to do something to help.
Yeah, I can imagine the stories that you've heard. When you're off duty, do you feel the need to, how do you process the stories that you've heard? Do you ever feel a need to step back from the gravity of your work in order to keep going?
Well, it's funny because when I was 10 years working for the UN Refugee Agency, and I was always on a quest to find the stories, and not just to be the communicator of misery, but to be the communicator of hope.
Yeah.
And I ended up with one particular story for at least 2 years of my life, doing a TED Talk about her, writing a book about her. This is Doa, a 19-year-old Syrian refugee who survived one of the worst shipwrecks on the Mediterranean Sea. And when she was rescued after 4 days and 4 nights on the water, Her fiance had died, had drowned. Almost all the 500 people on that boat had drowned. And she was rescued with 2 babies on her chest who are not her own. And one of them survived, and she survived too. And that's why the book is called A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. And it's been translated into multiple languages. It was optioned for a film by Spielberg and J.J. Abrams. And so, and all of them have told me, and the people who read it and people who have never even heard of a refugee, or let alone a Syrian or a Muslim Syrian, was like, how is Doa? I want to know more about her. Oh my God, this story. And that war in Syria is terrible. I'm going to try to learn more. Why don't we have more resettlement? How can we get, so all of these, for me, it was just proof that this works.
Yeah.
There are so many Doa stories. And her story told the story of millions of refugees. And it was, I couldn't let it go. I was thinking about it day and night. But it was also so gratifying to see it move so many people and change their minds and hopefully even policies.
You might be glad to know that A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, I read that book when I was very young. I was like 19, 20, and I was just starting my path to journalism and telling the stories of women and girls, refugee women and girls. And that was a catalyst. Your book was a catalyst for the work that I do today.
I didn't know that. Thanks for saying that, Sarah. And I know that you're doing so much on behalf of young women, girls, women, and that you're also a storyteller. Yeah. It's so needed.
The world, we were talking earlier about the rise in conflicts, and the world is witnessing, as you know, the highest number of global conflicts since World War II. And the responsibility of shaping the UN's messaging during times of crisis is enormous. It's an enormous responsibility. How do you balance, like we're talking about hope, how do you balance the need to maintain hope while at the same time communicating with urgency without overwhelming or paralyzing the global public?
Well, if the UN were to lose hope, then there wouldn't be much hope left for the people that we're serving.
Yeah.
And so I think it's our obligation not just to do our work, do what we're paid for, but to live up to the values that the UN represents. And those values are not just, working for peace, working to protect the world's most vulnerable and lift them up, working on human rights, fundamental freedoms, but it's also to keep trying. If everything else is failing, there must be another way. Yeah. So it's always a struggle. It's less, we're sitting here in New York very often in crisis calls with our colleagues on the ground in Sudan, in Gaza. Today it was our colleagues in Lebanon, in Syria, who are themselves actually in danger. Mm-hmm. And yet they're staying and trying to help people who are even more vulnerable than them.
Yeah.
So this is how we hold on to hope, because then we get the stories of, and it's hard because I truly believe there are many conflicts that the UN has prevented. Yes, we have record numbers now, but through our peacekeeping missions, through our peace operations, through our mediation, and even our just robust presence in so many countries in the world, the UN is a stabilizing factor, and it is upholding and pressuring governments to uphold human rights. It's very hard to prove, but I know it's true, but we do get evidence now and then that we have helped individuals and lifted people up, and that also keeps us going.
We know that in so many ways, women and girls bear the brunt of war and conflict and displacement, and in many post-conflict settings, women and girls have to rebuild their lives with limited resources. In your experience, what are some of the most critical but overlooked needs of those trying to rebuild their lives in post-conflict settings, particularly women and girls?
No, I mean, I think one thing that does make me feel proud is that much of the UN, especially the humanitarian organizations, are the first to come and the last to leave.
Mm-hmm.
When the cameras have left, and that is inevitable. That's actually my job, to try to keep the attention going. But then the donor money starts drying up, and that's one of the most frustrating things I hear from colleagues in a post-conflict setting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there's so much to be done to help people get through this, to help people rebuild their lives, to on the peace process, on stabilizing. One of the most effective ways to create stability is to involve women and girls, especially women at the peace table. But in community meetings, and they're usually not involved in waging the war. And yet, as you said, they suffer the consequences more than anyone. And the women and the children. Women are too often also targets of the war in the form of rape as a weapon of war, the most sickening weapon of war, and the scars from that, because the intention is not just to hurt them at that moment, but to have a cultural effect and to have them ostracized and split apart from their families and their communities, to break them. And that's where we need to help. They need the tools with which to heal, whether it's therapy, it's the funding so they could start small businesses, the community involvement, and also even just the sensitivity to the community that this is not their fault.
Yeah.
They need medical care often. And so there's so much investment that should be made and far too little that's possible because of, just as you said, donors moving on to the next conflict and war that is most acute.
Yeah. More to her story, the news organization I run, we focus on highlighting solutions journalism. So we focus on solutions journalism by highlighting both the immense challenges that women and girls face around the world, but also the solutions and the initiatives that they're doing to overcome those challenges. I'm sure you've seen so many positive solutions or initiatives by people all over the world. What is an example of a solution that you've seen or a story that you've heard that has inspired hope in you?
First of all, I would just like to say I'm so excited that you said that you were using solutions journalism, because I've been really heartened by this initiative that is training newsrooms all over the United States and the world, and in Europe there's the constructive journalism, and it's really just not, keep doing your rigorous job of reporting, but adding that element of, there is somebody who is solving the problem, or it was solved somewhere else, and bring this in, so that in actually finding that people are staying with these stories much longer. Yeah. People don't want to hear how terrible everything is all the time.
It goes back to your earlier point about compassion fatigue.
It's compassion fatigue, and the fact is the solutions are right in our face. There are solutions there, and I'm so glad to hear that you're working on that. I'm trying to think, for some reason my mind keeps going when you talk about women and girls to the most egregious example of,
I know,
which is Afghanistan. And during the General Assembly here, the Secretary General spoke at a meeting that was organized by some Afghan women's organizations and member states, and Meryl Streep spoke there, and we have the women of Afghanistan are figuring out, in the worst of possible, most dystopian circumstances, how to still learn, how to find ways to get their voices out, to show that they can still sing, even though it's forbidden to sing. And Meryl Streep said, and this resonated, it keeps getting picked up in the press over and over again, that that a cat has more rights than an Afghan girl or woman because that cat can put its face in the sun. Now, is that a solution? No, but it is an example of the international community coming together in the middle of the United Nations General Assembly and saying, we're going to put a spotlight on the horrific situation for women and girls in Afghanistan, and we're going to invite people who were there, who are activists, who really care. One of the most famous actresses in the world who deeply cares and can express so well this situation, and then really point out what could be the solutions to the plight of women and girls. I think we still need to just keep demanding, keep plugging away, keep pressuring, and not forget them.
We covered that story too. Add more to her story.
You did.
And
what struck you about it?
I mean, it just what you're saying. I mean, it was. I think it's amazing that you guys brought this very, very high profile person in to shed light on the situation for girls and women in Afghanistan during the height of the UN General Assembly. I mean, it says a lot.
The de facto authorities, the Taliban, are trying to silence the women and girls. They're depriving them of education, of work, and the ability to even circulate, go to the park, speak outside.
It's so dystopian.
And so it is so we need their voices heard. And so in the most high profile political arenas. And so hopefully it contributed a bit, but we can't just leave it at that. We have to keep putting on the pressure. I mean, I think there are, I know that women, peace, and security is a huge area of focus for our peacekeepers. And it really strikes me to see how many women peacekeepers we have now and what role they're playing. For example, in South Sudan, they're not just standing there providing kind of stability and security. They are going out into the communities. They are helping women organize, helping them with finding their voices and investing in their capabilities to rise politically and at the peace table. So I think that's a really important kind of underreported role that our peacekeepers are playing.
Absolutely. That's a story that needs to be told. You have both witnessed and actively been a part of shaping how global crises are communicated to the world. I mean, that's a huge thing. It's a huge role. If you could reshape the way global organizations like the UN communicate about humanitarian crises, what would you change? What do you think is missing from the way that we currently tell stories?
Well, I keep trying to impress on my teams and all teams that we do have a communication strategy that's been tried and tested, but it's easy to kind of forget because we're in just crisis mode all the time. That we're not. We have in journalism, you have five W's. I mean, many of my team are former journalists, and we all kind of, when we're doing UN news, we adhere to the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. But we're working for a cause. Mm-hmm. So we need to put out the what, the facts. And the UN is the source of so much data and information about what's happening in the world, or science of climate change, et cetera. That's important, but there are 2 other W's that will make you effective, and that is why care and what now. And the why care part is just so important, but it's not easy. It really is thinking about who do I need to reach to move the needle? Like, who is important for me to change their minds, have them feel empathy, have them want to change their policies. And then there's the what now. So once you got them to care, don't leave them. Say, and this is where maybe the solutions come in. Here's our call to action. Here's the way to solve the problem. Here's an example of where it's going to be solved. Here's how you can get involved. And that's a formula that it's my mantra, and I say that it needs to be in everything. It needs to be in our public speeches. It needs to be in our press releases. It needs to be in our news stories, because there is an answer to getting out of even the world's most horrific wars and intractable problems. It's not a simple answer, and it's not an easy formula, but show that there are people working on it at least.
That's a great formula. I've never heard that.
Because I made it up. No, it's been my formula, and I've been using it in our communication strategy since I was at UNHCR, and then I brought it here to the UN. So why care, what now?
Easy. Effective.
Easy. It sounds easy, but it's not easy. It's actually much harder than the kind of traditional communications that we're maybe used to, as just, broadcasting the news and then moving on to the next.
Yeah.
That's not enough.
Thank God they have you.
Well, I hope there's so much more that we can learn and do. And, the information environment has become so challenging.
Yeah.
It's so much harder than when I started my career. When social media came onto the scene, we were all very excited about it because we could communicate directly with people before, by going to classrooms or delivering lectures or meeting with people. But mostly we worked through journalists, and which we still do, and it's really incredibly important. But then we were able, with social media platforms, to speak to people directly and to engage them directly. And we have huge followings on our social media platforms, millions of followers in the UN who are following the UN, and hopefully getting informed and getting inspired by what the UN is posting. But we're operating in a very toxic information environment where we're competing with hate speech and disinformation. And some of it is actually directed at us. And that's a huge challenge. And it's in all of the areas where we're trying to make a difference and where we're trying to make progress, whether it's, working on stopping a war, whether it is protecting women and girls. We see women journalists, I mentioned women leaders, women climate activists, particularly under attack in that space. And we're working to promote climate action. We're working to encourage voices who are working on behalf of saving our planet to be out there, and yet they're becoming really vulnerable. So it's a really difficult information environment, and that's why we're not only trying to continuously navigate it, be more strategic, and also be in those spaces where disinformation actors and hate actors are leading people astray. But also we just came out with UN Global Principles on Information Integrity, which is our blueprint for a healthy information ecosystem. So it's our kind of advocacy document.
Speaking of women leaders, you are a woman who has risen to a high place of power in a field dominated by men. For all the young women listening right now who want to make an impact in the world, what wisdom do you have?
Well, I started somewhere, and I think the first is to just feel what is making your heart race in a positive way. Like when you choose your profession, it should be about what you really care about deeply. And is this going to, you're going to spend so many hours of your day in your workplace. So choose a profession that you feel like this is when I go home at night, I'm going to feel like I didn't just go and spend 8 hours, come home exhausted, and have a paycheck, but I spent 8 hours contributing to the world in some way, big or small. Any contribution helps. So I've always felt that the career path I've chosen was one that I could feel proud of, and that really kept me going. I also was flexible. I changed organizations after working several years at one, and then changed to another, and then changed to another, but spent meaningful periods of time at each one, and I was curious. I always open to meeting colleagues, trying not to be shy about asking people above me to give me advice, and to give me feedback as well. And then joining networking groups. I would look back and I would say almost every one of my next jobs was because I had reached out and joined some kind of networking group, and people started to get to know me, and because then I was active in that group, and then I hosted people, and then once a job was opening, then they'll think of you. So you're not doing it at the moment when you're looking for a job, but someday you might be. So I think that's it, and support other women.
So important.
I think it's so important. I think now I try to spend time mentoring younger women colleagues, and it's one of the highlights of my work to be able to work with them and help and see their career progress. And so I think there are a lot of older women in whatever profession who would really welcome the opportunity. If it's not organized in your workplace, just go and reach out to them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've learned as a young woman myself who's trying to pave her own way, is just the importance of relationship building. And it takes time, and it's not an overnight thing. And it's not a transaction either. It's about actually building a real relationship.
It's true. And, people actually feel kind of chuffed and to be able to give advice to somebody, to maybe somebody who looks like their younger self. So I think that's important. I know that COVID has allowed many young people to work from home, but I can't imagine my career having come this far if I was not in person with people in the same room, in the hallways, grabbing lunch, going for coffee, having a drink after work, and these kind of informal networks that form. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I meet a lot of people, and probably a lot more people with technological possibilities that we can, do a lot of things online. Then I see them in person and I don't even recognize them because all I saw was a head.
Yeah.
And you don't get the whole person feeling of, so yeah, I would suggest come into the office, or if you don't work in I know you don't work in an office, Sarah, but you go and interview people and get to know people, and that's really
Definitely.
key.
Melissa, the last question that I end all of my podcasts on is also a bit unconventional. It is, what is the more to your story? This podcast is called More to Her Story. What is something you wish more people knew about you? Not as the UN's chief communicator, but as Melissa Fleming, the person behind the role.
That I'm vulnerable like everybody else. I used to think I was invincible myself in many ways, that I could travel anywhere. I didn't need that much sleep. I could work multiple hours. I could maintain a marriage and have 2 children and deal with jet lag until breast cancer hit me. And I then used that time to, even though I was going through brutal chemotherapy, and I just kept working until it just didn't work anymore. And then I was writing the book at the time too. It was just finishing off. And so I did finally, as the treatment was really wearing me down, take some time, and I started journaling. I started meditating, doing so much more self-care, and really appreciating how my own health, but also how fragile life is. I used to look at it as fragile for other people in war zones and in other places, but it's fragile for me, and the effect that has on my family and the people around me, that we all need to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves so that we can take care of other people. But I think it's also allowed me to be so much more, it opened up a whole new world of knowledge and empathy around people who are struggling with health issues, and there are so many. Breast cancer itself, how many women, how many young women are diagnosed. I remember at the time when I was diagnosed, I had met a woman in a refugee camp in Lebanon who was living in a tent, and she had told me that the chemotherapy treatment in Lebanon was too expensive for her and she didn't have any health care. So once a month, she would somehow manage to smuggle herself back into Syria so that she could get chemotherapy treatment and then smuggle herself back, put herself in danger to go back. It was when the war was raging there. And then come back to save herself because she had her children, she had her family. And I was just thinking, wow, we're all going through some kind of struggle, and we really have to reach out to people and assume that they might be going through something too, and that we can also reach out to them.
Yeah. Wow. What a story. You are a strong woman.
I think it made me stronger. I think going through that, even though I really felt, I had to kind of rethink my whole identity because I was all of a sudden a woman in a hospital bed with stage 3 cancer that could have killed me, and realizing, okay, what is important in my life? I looked at my husband, my 2 children, and I thought, I have to do everything possible to survive, and everything else is secondary at that moment. But it also then, once I managed to go through it and survive it and meet so many other wonderful people who were also survivors, or some who died, I was just like, it gave me some new strength that I didn't know that I had in me. And I think strength and empathy, I think that's what it is. Yeah. I could see people differently. And, my heart expanded.
Wow. Your whole life and your whole career has been about seeing people. I love that.
I think, before it was, a lot of it was something that was kind of just part of my growing up. My mother is kind of like that, very sensitive towards other people who suffer, or animals who suffer. But then it was like telling the stories of others, and then somehow when you have your own story, then it comes full circle.
Yeah. Such is life.
Such is life. Yeah.
Well, Melissa, thank you for taking the time to be on this podcast. It was an honor to have you on. I think you're amazing.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for what you do in highlighting voices of women and the stories of how much incredible and the stories of all that they're doing to make our world also more peaceful and more prosperous and more humane.
To peace.
To peace.
To peace. You are a strong woman.
I think it made me stronger. I think going through that, even though I really felt, I had to kind of rethink my whole identity because I was all of a sudden a woman in a hospital bed with stage 3 cancer that could have killed me, and realizing, okay, what is important in my life? I looked at my husband, my 2 children, And I thought, I have to do everything possible to survive, and everything else is secondary at that moment. But it also then, once I managed to go through it and survive it and meet so many other wonderful people who were also survivors, or some who died, I was just like, it gave me some new strength that I didn't know that I had in me. And I think strength and empathy, I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
I could see people differently. And, my heart expanded.
Wow. Your whole life and your whole career has been about seeing people. I love that.
I think, before it was, a lot of it was something that was kind of just part of my growing up. My mother's kind of like that, very sensitive towards other people who suffer, or animals who suffer. But then it was like telling the stories of others, and then somehow when you have your own story, then it comes full circle.
Yeah. Well, Melissa, thank you for taking the time to be on this podcast. It was an honor to have you on. I think you're amazing.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for what you do in highlighting voices of women.
To peace.
To peace.
To peace.